Good morning, everybody. It's so nice to see your friendly names in the participant list, if not your faces, it would be if we were in person. I am Meredith McCarroll, and I am so excited to gather together the group that we have this morning to talk about this important work around anti-racism and decentering whiteness in Appalachian Studies programs. As some of you might know, I'm the incoming president of ASA, and I am in that role with a real focus on these questions. I've been on the executive committee and steering committee the past couple of years and have both concern generally about how we keep our focus and attention on this work, but I also have a lot of hope and faith in the possibility of organizations that are collective, like ASA, to be transformed and to continue to evolve. But I don't think that that work happens passively. And so I called upon some directors of Appalachian Studies programs to speak to the work that they're doing. And to be clear, I do not intend for this to be, none of us intend for this to be a time where we pat ourselves on the back for what we have done. Instead, we all agree that there is work ahead of us and that the best way that we can use our energy is to think about that hard work and to be really concrete in what is ahead of us and how do we bring together these theories, these ideas that I think we all more or less share with some practices. And that's where the really hard work is. So I've asked each of our panelists here to introduce themselves and to say a little bit about their role and a little bit about their program. And then this will really be just an open conversation. I've got a few questions that I've shared with them, and we'll just try to keep this open. And I'm so glad to see some of the folks in the audience that I know are a part of Appalachian Studies programs, either as students, as faculty, and I hope that we'll definitely have space for conversation afterwards. So Teresa Burris, I'll start with you and ask you just to introduce yourself and say a little bit about your program.
Sure. Thank you, Meredith. I am the director of Appalachian Studies and the Appalachian Regional and Rural Studies Center at Radford University in Radford, Virginia. I also wear another hat. I'm the director of academic outreach for Radford at the Southwest Virginia Higher Education Center here in Abingdon, which is where I am right now. I have been in this role, it will be 11 years come July 1st. I am the only, just to give you some history of our program and our center, I am the second person to hold this position. My predecessor and role model, Dr. Grace Tony Edwards, started this with some other colleagues on Radford's campus. And yeah, I'll stop there. And I guess I'll share that I teach graduate, here lately I've been teaching only graduate classes in the Appalachian Studies program, as well as an Appalachian literature class for the English department and a social and cultural foundations of place-based education for our EDD program. And I'm in the process, and this is directly related to our topic today, I'm in the process of creating a critical theories course that I'll be teaching this summer for our EDD program as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Teresa. And I think I see Grace Tony Edwards in the crowd.
Yay! Yay, great.
Chris Green, can you go next?
Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Green, and I'm the director of the Loyola Jones Appalachian Center at Berea College. I've been here for 9 years. Also chair the Appalachian Studies Department, which is a very small department, is what I will say. There's one full-time and a couple of mini half-time people that we're working with. The work at Berea is, as much as people think of Berea as a foundational place, it's always changing and always moving and always adapting as we have new centers come on board, new people to work with, and new visions for the college. Having been through some very big changes, those are ongoing changes too. So a lot of that is coming into play with us, is how I think about working with racism and with race. And I won't bring up any of those now because I'll get a chance to play with them later on, but I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks, Chris. And then Julie Shepard-Powell.
Good morning. I just want to first acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from my office here at Appalachian State in Boone, and that's on the traditional territory of the Cherokee, the Monotan, and Yuchi peoples. So I make this acknowledgement as a way to just bring awareness to Indigenous peoples in our region, as well as land rights. And I also do so in the spirit of this panel as part of decentering whiteness, and as we consider the history of colonialism and how to upend the settler colonialist society that we all live and work in. So I am an assistant professor here at the Center for Appalachian Studies. I'm also the graduate program director. So I recruit and mentor and support students in our MA for Appalachian Studies program. The center, as many of you know, was founded in 1978, and we coordinate academic programs on our campus related to Appalachia, as well as do community work and research projects, and very much a focus on collaborative work. So I'm excited about the ways that decentering whiteness in this anti-racism work can build upon those collaborative relationships we have. And finally, before I turn it back over to Meredith, I just wanted to say that I really appreciate Dr. Sherry Everts, who's the Chancellor of Appalachian State. She's here with us this morning tuning in. So thank you, Dr. Everts, for supporting Appalachian Studies and the ASA this year.
Thank you, Julie. So part of my journey in thinking about these questions and these obligations around anti-racism, as a literary scholar first and a critical race theory scholar next, I spend a lot of time thinking about words. And so, so many of the words that we use with good intention become empty, meaningless words when they're overused. And so I want to acknowledge that and think carefully and talk about what do these words mean. And so one of the first words that comes to mind here for me is diversity, right? This is a word that some schools have moved away from because diversity has meant certain things at certain times. And so I just want to ask each of you, how do you define diversity within your school and within your program, and acknowledge for everyone in the audience that you are in, I see you in this sort of pivotal position. You both have power to shape conversations, but you also have limited power because you're faculty and you have administrative roles, but you are not the system, right? So acknowledging that the definitions of diversity may not be in your control necessarily. We can just go in the same order, Teresa, Chris, and Julie.
Okay. Let me bring up my notes here, Meredith. First of all, let me say, Julie, thank you for acknowledging the land that we are on. I mean, where I am is Cherokee land as well. And I think that is, I've been in so many sessions this year where that has been the start of the webinar. And I think that's critical because it brings awareness to the colonization and displacement and annihilation in a lot of situations. So my notes, when you asked that question, you know, I was thinking about race, ethnicity, class, gender, sexual orientation, age, ability, geographic location, language, dialect, and religion. Those were some of the topics, you know, the categories that I was thinking about. And you know, geographically, it's interesting, and I don't know if this is true in Kentucky and North Carolina as it is in Southwest Virginia, but there are, I don't know, hierarchies, if you will, and stigmas around even what we call far Southwest Virginia, from just looking from Wythe County down through the coal fields to Lee County. And somewhat of a, like, well, Washington County and Abingdon are, the blue bloods. The coal counties are not at a certain level. So there are all these layers of oppression, I think, that oftentimes they don't go into the normal, or I'll say the normal discourse around DEI work. So I just wanted to bring that to the conversation.
Thanks, Teresa. And Chris?
Thank you. I'm going to ask maybe the people who aren't in the session could turn off your cameras. Like, hi, Wilburn. That way you can just see the people who are in the session, although we would love to hear from people later on too. This is a complex topic at Berea. When I first came to Berea, first of all, they did not count their Appalachian students. There was an assumption that everybody was from Appalachia, and that was a wrong assumption. They were called in territory and out of territory students. And they also counted African-American students, biracial or primarily African-American. Those were, and international students. Those are all that we talked about with diversity when I got here. Since that time, the college has moved. There was a very active recruitment of Hispanic students. Now it's about, let me see my notes here, about 14% of our student population, and about half of those students are from the larger Appalachian region. We're now about 25% African-American students here. We're very fortunate for that, through very recruiting. And about 40% of those are from the larger Appalachian region. We also have here, so only about a fourth of our students, though, are from the at-risk and distressed counties in central and extended Appalachia. So even Appalachian students, which are only about 45% of our student body now, are one of our minorities on campus. And hence, one of the really fortunate things about the way Berea works is that we have dedicated centers. We're really fortunate to be able to have a center dedicated to interracial education, a center dedicated to the study of Christianity, a center dedicated to international students, and a center dedicated to Appalachia. So one of my works in helping think about diversity with Appalachia is that I point out that Appalachia, and I keep telling everybody that our Appalachian students are of all varieties. They are not just white. And you'd be surprised to see students having to think about this too. And I can talk more about how we do that later on, but that's one of the big moves here is actually saying that our students of color come from someplace, instead of just being recognized by the college as students of color. And that's, I think, important, because all of a sudden that means our other students who are also from, I don't know if they're from Knoxville or from Harlan, Kentucky, feel known and also can talk with the other kids around them and the other students around them too. So that's just a quick overview. So yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. And that gets at the questions of, or the issue of intersectionality, of course, right? That people are not just in one category or another. Julie, what about you? How are y'all defining diversity at Appalachian?
So I think a lot of what Chris and Teresa both said really apply here too. And for us, I think, when we think about diversity, it's, those groups who have been left out of the dominant narratives about the region or dominant representations of the region, for reasons of colonial history and all the kinds of other things that I'm sure we'll get into when we talk through some of the other questions later. So I think, when we think about highlighting diversity or increasing diversity, it's really those points of intersection with those underrepresented communities we're talking about, all the categories that Teresa listed earlier, for sure. And Appalachian as an institution has certainly been working on that and working towards, higher enrollment, for example, of underrepresented populations. So I think 18% was what we started fall 2020 with, which was our largest in history. And I think there's a big push on campus with our chief diversity officer and different programs to kind of continue that way. And certainly in Appalachian studies, we're looking towards that as well as recruiting more underrepresented students and making sure that the kinds of programs and curriculum development we do also reflect this great diversity.
Thanks, Julie. And I didn't send this question to you, but I think it's just worth acknowledging. I mean, I said I wanted to think about language and what words we use. And diversity is something, you know, diversity and inclusion, like this, all of these words get used so often. I think it might be worth either here or at some point later in our conversation, talking about why this matters, right? This has to do with not just the numbers that we can read out about our schools and about our programs, but it has to do with power and access. Anybody want to just like talk through that? Like what, not just how you're defining diversity and what those numbers look like, but why it matters.
Sorry.
All right, some technical difficulties. I think everyone can see this in the chat, so I'm just going to address this for a second. Teresa Burris is in a situation where she cannot hear anyone, which is unfortunate as a panelist. So Teresa, it sounds like calling in is your best option. So we'll watch for you in that. Okay. All right. Let me move to this next question then. So what would you say are your program's goals for anti-racism? Chris, I'll start with you.
Well, this goes back, I'll go back to this word diversity too, which is diversity is so easily emptied of the reality of the structural oppressions and cultural richness that is born into it. And from those specific histories. So what we're doing in many ways is to more fully address the lived diversity of our students in particular, which is a little bit different from the lived diversity of all of Appalachia, because I'm really focusing on educating our students about themselves and about each other too. So one thing that we've done is Berea has been very fortunate in being able to have a tour where we take faculty and staff, and this has been going on since the 60s, into Appalachia. When I came on board, what I decided to do was we were going to go to Morristown, Tennessee. We were going to go to a Appalachian church, but it was Catholic, right? Because that Catholic church is an important institution there, and it's half Latino, half white. And we were going to go to urban spaces too. We're going to go to Knoxville, and we're going to talk with people working in the African American community, leaders of it, about what's going on there. So it's about trying to working with the people who are there. And this includes also thinking about gender diversity in the region too. And I'm really fortunate to have excellent colleagues in our Women's and Non-Gender Conforming Center too, who we are working together to tag team all the time. So it's about helping people to find themselves and then understand, I think for me, where they are in the structure. And I could go on, but I want to hear what Julie has to say.
Okay, so I'll go back to Meredith, to your question about kind of why diversity and inclusion are important. And one thing I'll say is that we've added equity onto that. So it's not just diversity and inclusion. So it's not just, you know, checking boxes saying we have this many students of color, or that, you know, we have this many scholars on our syllabi. It's meant to make kind of more substantial changes with that kind of addition of equity. So really trying to challenge, you know, the power structures at play from our history, like we've been talking about already here today, So, things like decolonizing the curriculum, right? Making sure that it's not just Eurocentric voices that we're hearing, but providing this opportunity to re-examine history, to kind of reinterpret it, and reimagine the future in new ways. So I think that's kind of some of where we're headed with curricular stuff. But I think also our goals here at the Center for Appalachian Study are to, one, stand alongside, our colleagues here and our fellow locals in Boone, including Black in Boone and Black at App, which are two organizations who have been really kind of leading the charge for change. And then, again, putting into action our commitments to anti-racism through things like the curriculum that I was talking about, but also through programmatic changes, community work. My goal and what I think we really want to do is we want people to look at us, people of color, of Latinx descent, to look at us and see the work we're doing and see themselves reflected in that. So it's not so that they feel like this is a place that they belong. And so it's a lot of hard work, I think, too, because there is that risk of just checking boxes and saying we've done things. And really what we want to see is kind of like a total upheaval of what things have been like before.
Teresa, do I see that you're with us now?
Yes, I don't know what happened. It just all of a sudden Chris was talking, I heard him, and then I didn't. So I'm sorry, Meredith.
That's okay. We are just talking about, I had posed the question, if we're going to use this term diversity, we should acknowledge, like, why do we care about diversity? Why are we having this conversation? And then more specifically, what are your program's goals in terms of anti-racism? And then I want to talk for a minute about the ways that diversity and anti-racism are not synonyms, that you can have a diverse, a space can be diverse and not anti-racist. So why does diversity matter? And then how are y'all working toward anti-racism, Teresa?
So I'll say that kind of segueing from what Julie was talking about, curricular initiatives, Radford is going through a general education change again. And I have revised the undergraduate Appalachian Studies minor. We have a 15 credit hour minor, and I've created a course, Diversity in Appalachia, specifically addressing this to debunk the myths of an all-white homogenous region. And as most of y'all know, I got my start, well, it actually goes back to kindergarten, but that's another story. But in terms of scholarship, writing my dissertation on the Appalachians, so that, it's been an integral part of my academic journey, the racial awareness and the diversity in our region. We also, we have a student-led group called Appalachian Events Committee, and we're having the students and the faculty advisors are having conversation around joining our diversity awareness programming on Radford's campus to show, that the region is diverse and have programs like, for example, in the past, even AEC has sponsored Gangsta Grass, a musical group on campus. We had a student-led vigil in the fall, and Appalachian Studies folks were involved in supporting. We were like a faculty guardian, if you will, and we participated in that. So, yeah, I'll stop there.
Well, that leads me, Teresa, to ask this other question about, as I'm stepping into this new role with ASA, I see my position as one where I aim to listen, enable, and facilitate. And I'm guessing that many of you feel a similar, well, I don't know, maybe not, but there's a way that being in each of your positions, you are in a spot where you can enable, or you could take on this work where you're really commanding, right? I know each of you. I don't see you as being the commanding type. So I'm curious how you are inviting, like, how is this, whose voices are involved in the work that's happening at your campus? So you just mentioned this, Teresa, what was the language you used? The faculty for the vigil?
The faculty guardians.
Right. So, and so I love that image of having faculty and administrators as guardians in that way of the enabling some of the work that naturally comes from our students. So I'm wondering how who's involved in making these decisions and building these initiatives at each of your schools. Chris, well, I don't want to call, well, if it's helpful, I'll call on you, but then we can have more of an open discussion.
Berea is a school of about 1,600 people. And so we're fortunate that we are close together. And we're also very fortunate in that there's been a concerted effort to have people who work with particular populations or work with particular goals to really work closely together too. And that has enabled me, for instance, to, when I was thinking about recruiting students to come here, and I wanted to reach out to our Black Cultural Center. So I reached out to that director with the blessings and encouragement of our VP of Diversity and Inclusion. I said, help me find some students to come, because, you know, all I know is the students I know, right? I would love to find students who I don't know who can challenge what we're doing. So that's one source. And another important source for me too has been the students themselves. Since I come to the center, we're really lucky at Berea to have the labor program where all of our students work on campus. And so throughout the Appalachian Center, there may be 9 or 10 students who work. And I've been very intentional about recruiting students of diversity, of diverse backgrounds, Hispanic, African American, Asian American, and really empowering them to be able to speak truths. I find one of my great difficulties is my old idealism, my old Marxist idealism, and my whiteness I'm pretty good at, but I need people to call me out, right? I need people to tell me when we're going things. So students can point at we have rolling screens, for instance, in our exhibits. And we have feature Bill Turner's Black in Appalachia exhibit. And they're like, people don't want to be called Black now. You need to say Black people. I was like, well, let's talk about this moment in history where there's this coming from and who this elder is who made this. And so their ability to be able to talk to me and bring that forth enabled both education to happen and also for me to hear where people are too now. I would say, and this goes into a challenge, as the newer faculty and visions come on board, understanding, much like what the language that Julie is using, I have similar but more distant language. And so what I mean by that is I know all about oppression. I know all about opposition. But this new way of thinking is something that I'm really having to be very open to and work to engage. And that's been more difficult in COVID times because we're not allowed to get together and talk. We're not allowed to go to sessions. So we have to really seek out intentional ways. So those are some of the ways that I'm working to do it at Berea.
Yeah, and I'll just say, you know, looking around the panelists, right, we're all white here, which is indicative of kind of, I think, the larger issue that we're talking around. But in thinking through that, right, it's really important to have kind of diverse voices participating and in a lot of ways driving the kind of movements towards change that we're talking about on our campuses. So for the Center for Appalachian Studies, we have an advisory board that includes faculty, students, some community members. So that's one way we kind of have some diverse voices in this. Of course, at an institutional level, we have Dr. Willie Fleming, who is the Chief Diversity Officer, and he was actually college roommates with Ed Cabell, who most of you probably know co-edited the book about Blacks in Appalachia back in the early 80s and was also the first African-American to receive an MA in Appalachian Studies. So Dr. Willie Fleming has been really wonderful to work with for us as an institution, but also as the center. So I think this is a difficult question too, in terms of, you know, the kind of collaborative work we want to do, but also making sure, you know, that we're really listening to our colleagues and our community members, especially who are people of color, in terms of what we're doing. I think that's really important, to sit back and kind of, Meredith, what you were saying, like kind of listen and enable, but also really get our hands dirty and do that work as well, and not just sit in the sidelines saying, go, go, you're doing great. We really want to be a part of that change too.
So I'll just mention that as Chris was talking about some of the centers he's working with on campus, I want to give a shout out to our Center for Diversity and Inclusion, CDI, on Radford's campus, as well as Dr. Sharon Jones. You know, Chris, when you were talking, it made me think about, you know, even though, you know, well, Julie, this gets to your point. Here I am, a white middle-aged woman, and my journey is learning about oppression and racism. It continues, and Sharon is leading. She's been leading book groups throughout the year, and right now we're reading the new Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. I mean, I feel like I can't facilitate this important work and keep up, Chris, to your point about, you know, how language changes and how that shapes our thinking about things. I have to do the professional work as well in order to, again, facilitate the conversations with diverse stakeholders. And it's something that I've found very interesting here lately, and it's in light of what has happened in our country. Well, it's been going on, as we know, for well over a century. It's just, you know, come to the fore. I've had some nonprofits in our region approach me to ask that I facilitate workshops around this diversity in Appalachia and cultural sensitivity trainings. So that's been another offshoot, you know, kind of our, I'm going to say, in-reach into community, not outreach, but it's just, I guess, something else that has come to the surface during all of this turmoil in our country.
Thanks to all of you. Let me just give some space here to see if there's anything that any of the three of you want to respond and have just a little bit more of a conversation here.
I'm curious about classes too in curriculum, because our curriculum is very spread out. It's across many departments. And there's one other faculty member and I who are deeply committed to changing our classes. And this was going on before Black Lives Matter happened. So like for my history class, we start by talking about the earth. And we talk about ancient indigenous civilizations. And we talk about that evolution. That's part of Appalachian history, right? And she has a class where she's working with primarily almost all white males for introducing freshmen from distressed and at-risk counties. And she can get them to talk about race in a way that is not often possible in many other classes, because there's places to hide, there's confrontation. So we're making those moves. But I'm curious about what, for instance, Julie, you were talking about your all's work with curriculum. And I'm curious about what other people are doing with that.
I can say a little bit more just in terms of kind of some of the ways we're really substantially working on that, is that they have an inclusive teaching lab here at Appalachian. So we're in the process of workshops with them and kind of more or less external review sort of our curriculum. So it's not just all of us looking at each other's, you know, syllabi and saying, oh, you know, this looks good, or this, you know, maybe needs some more work. But I think, you know, struggle with the same thing where we have, certain AS classes, Appalachian Studies classes, but then the rest of our courses are in the history department or sociology or philosophy and religion or wherever on campus. And so I think there is a little bit of a struggle in terms of thinking how through how to kind of reach all of those faculty. Although I do think a lot of my colleagues in those departments are really committed to this similar kind of work as well.
It makes me think a little bit about, I remember years ago reading the Audre Lorde, and the quote that struck me so much was, "The master's tools can never dismantle the master's house." And I consistently push against that and understand the context in which Lorde wrote that, but also wonder, what am I doing in an institution then? What am I doing in a, like, I actually personally believe that institutions can be spaces for transformation and change. And I wonder, when we're thinking about this at the level on which we're speaking, thinking about Appalachian Studies programs, where do these changes take place? Is it about the curriculum? Is it about the reading list in classes? Is it about the students who are in those spaces? I mean, certainly it's all of those things, but I wonder if anyone wants to kind of speak to that broad question of the master's tools and the master's house.
I'll just say one quick thing, which I've shared with the panelists, which is just my thinking about Appalachian Studies as a discipline or as a field of study, since the 70s, when it was, the ASA was formed. And even really before that, work in Appalachia was really pretty radical and on the forefront of these kinds of changes. So, we think about the Highlander Center and all of the anti-racist and nonviolent civil disobedience trainings they were doing during the civil rights era, to, like Helen Lewis and her work, really valuing community knowledge. And so I think because Appalachian Studies has never been a discipline that's just been kind of navel gazing or just totally wrapped up in the ivory tower, we've always been on the ground and in those communities. I see it as the perfect place to lead this charge and to really make substantial change, not just in the classroom, but by taking theory to practice, right? Taking it out into the community and working with community members and learning from community members, as opposed to just sitting here and reading some ethnographies or whatever, the discipline is, and then, moving on. So I think we're really well situated to really make some substantial change.
I agree with that. Julie, when you were talking, it made me think about one of my former undergraduate students and her capstone project, where she was in Daint, Virginia. It's spelled Dante, but pronounced Daint, and was collecting oral histories from African Americans in that coal community, or former coal community. And, like you said, not just reading someone else's work, but she was actually in community, capturing these stories to preserve, to give back to them, but also to have in our archives. And I think that's, here again, going back to facilitation, I think that when we as faculty, we have to model this, that we don't just stay in our offices or our classrooms or in front of the computer nowadays, that we are in community and intentionally cultivating relationships with people in our communities that we are a part of, and then providing opportunities for our students. I think that is one of the ways that we can work towards this DEI goals.
I agree too. I think that I've recently, here's my new revelation about Appalachian Studies. It's nice to have new revelations, that it is indeed about story. It is indeed about meeting people. It's about talking. It's about connecting. It's about enabling other people and listening to other people's stories too. And I think because I was just helping a student write an independent study proposal, an independent major proposal for Appalachian Studies. And that's what it struck me, is that something I bring to every class, and I think my colleagues who teach in Appalachian Studies, our health in Appalachia class, has people tell health narratives of wherever they're from. They learn about Appalachia, but then those health narratives go to their narrative. They're learning to speak themselves as part of the experience of the structures they've had, but with critical awareness of where those structures have come from too. So I think that that's a particular gift that we have in Appalachian Studies, because we're under less of a jurisdiction, disciplinary must do in this way. Instead, I find it again and again, it's about, as you all said, meeting people, talking with them. So for my Appalachian Issues class, we're going to be remote. So how are we going to meet people? Well, I'm going to challenge them. I'm going to say, well, let's list out those issues, and we're talking community issues. And then we're going to go find people who are working on those issues. And we're going to do these oral histories with them. And we're going to create from those too. So it's about acknowledging story, hearing it, and using that to transform ourselves. And so I see that as a really, and that's, when I say that, it's also important to move beyond the expected stories, right? So it's about talking people who are working with opioid epidemic. It's about talking with the leader of the Laurel County African American Heritage Center. And intentionally challenging my students to do that, because oftentimes they'll just want to go talk to their grandpa.
I see a hand, and Brandon, I definitely want to hear from you. Give me just a minute, and then we'll go to your question and open it up. But I want to call out that, and I think we're all aware of this, but I'll say that my experience with ASA as an organization was so welcoming, so affirming. It modeled for me a different way to be an academic that was so crucial to me. I connected with people, I felt seen. And then I began to talk with other people of color, and realized that this was not the experience that many of them were having at ASA. And that is a huge part of why I stepped into this role. Not that I can fix it, but that I can keep us paying attention to it, right? I can keep pushing that a little bit. And I'm certainly not the only one. There are a lot of people who are directing our attention to those questions. But I hope that you'll all tune in tomorrow to the closing plenary session, which is a production of the Black in Appalachia podcast. And Wilburn Haynes, who's in the meeting, is featured in that podcast. But there are other voices in the podcast that point out to the ways that they feel invisible in ASA, and these are all Black scholars and activists who have come to ASA, who have been involved in ASA, and who have felt that they did not have a space here. And so I want to kind of bridge this question. The question I posed for y'all was, how do you know you're making progress? I believe that you all have good intentions. And one of the questions Julie asked us to consider was, how do we implement and embody real change rather than just paying lip service to these ideas of diversity and inclusion? So what will this look like in your programs, and what will this look like at ASA? How will we know that we've done something different, and how can we create an ASA that feels welcoming to queer scholars, to radical activists, to young people, to people of color, to all of the people who have not necessarily felt as included as like I did when I was a young scholar? I'll just open it up to whoever wants to go, and then we'll shift toward questions.
So I have a couple thoughts about that. One is, I don't think, there's ever any point where we're going to like make it. And so I think it's kind of just a constant process of change and pushing ourselves in ways that are uncomfortable often, but really important to making change. But just listening to talk about the ASA and various folks that haven't felt welcome or felt like they had a space there, I think that's a really beautiful way to conceptualize what the future could be, which is that they would see a space for themselves there, that it would be welcoming and open, and that, as I kind of said earlier, that they would see themselves reflected back. When they're looking at ASA, they see themselves. So whether, like you said, queer scholars, radical activists, scholars of color, Latinx scholars, or community members, or whoever, I think having that space is a way to think about starting to move towards progress.
I think progress is done incrementally. We have goals, right? We need to set them. So I want to have students of color working in my center who are not even necessarily Appalachian, right? But people who care about it. So it's about setting those goals and being very intentional about reaching them. And I think that the call of this conference is a call for one of that. But then it's up to us just not to do it, but to then to actually listen and figure out how do we enact it too. I noticed that Sophia, whose last name's not going to come to me, is now, I don't know her role, but I know she was on the committee helping to plan the conference. And
Sophia Enriquez.
Thank you, thank you. And she's on the Weatherford committee now. When I first came on the Weatherford committee, which is a big awards committee, there were only white people on it, right? So we had to make very, not only intentional, because there's really, you know, Robert Hayden, what an amazing thinker, what an amazing giver, ask him on board too. But what I found is when I opened the door, nobody would walk through it. I had to go in and really reach out and invite people in too. And we've had really great dialogues around that. So in part, it's about who's there. It's about who's at the table, right? It's about who's at the table, and it's about for our white members like myself, being incredibly mindful. I know that sometimes I listen to a session and it's hard for me to listen to, right? You know, somehow, and I'm a person who's done a lot of self-thinking about this, but I continue to. And so how do we continue to hold ourselves open and then find moments for dialogue there too, not to shutter oneself off? So that's not an easy answer, because I don't know quite how to measure it, Meredith. Maybe if you understand, you can tell us. But it's about the advancing of our dialogue. It's about our advancing of who's at the table. It's about our advancing of what we're seeing published and studied too.
Yeah, there is no finish line. Even though I'm a runner, there is no finish line. And we have to be vigilant and continuously check ourselves. And I think here again, what Chris was saying and Julia said as well, we keep going back to relationships. And Chris said, you know, being very intentional about who we are reaching out to. And that takes time, because the thing that we need to avoid is tokenism. And that's not, I mean, I know that our hearts are, that's not what we're after, but we also, it takes time to develop trust. And especially when you look at historically at how marginalized people have been marginalized, oppressed, you know, treated in our country. So here come these white folks, right? These white heterosexual folks. Yeah, there's got to be that genuine desire to hear, to not come in and talk, but to listen and be present. Yeah.
Well, and I'll just agree. I think that this work, the work of letting go of power, should not feel good to the people who have held power. It should be uncomfortable, as Chris said. It should be challenging, and there should not be too much, I think, celebration. And I agree that there's not a finish line, that it's a process. At this point, I would love to open it up. Brandon, I know you had a question, and other people certainly can raise hands, and I'll try to monitor both the chat, but also the way you raise your hands, just for anyone here, is if you go up to the very top, there's a picture of a little face with a hand raising, and you click on the hand raise, and then we'll call on you. And I think, if possible, you can unmute and show yourselves, and we can have more of a conversation. Brandon, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I'm typing in the chat that I'm having issues.
All right, so I'm seeing,
Really?
Oh, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Did you hear me say shit a second ago?
No, but we heard you this time.
Whatever. All right. So, hi, Brandon Zellers. Can't really. Oh, hold on. Sorry. I'm having issues right now with Microsoft Teams. Put a circus over this whole panel, first of all. So I guess I just got my voice here. I don't think I have video, and I don't even know if I'm still being heard. But I'm hearing that you all want to do a lot of talking, and not a lot. I don't hear really a lot of action coming out of any of you. Like, I hear a lot of like, well, we want to listen. I hear a lot of we want to have these conversations and bring certain people in, but I don't really hear any plans to hire more Black faculty. I don't really hear plans to change departmental rules so that directors can not have these long restrictions on them that sort of amount to structural inequality. I know that we had a director search at the Center for Appalachian Studies, and there were no quote unquote qualified Black candidates, which I know is nonsense, right? But because there are these certain structural rules that kind of were put in place.
Brandon, you just dropped out. Are you there? All right. I'm tempted to take what we heard of his question, which I think we understand, and respond to that, and hopefully he can hear us.
Well, I think that oh, Teresa, you
go ahead. No, go ahead.
Can't see me saying no. You go,
Teresa, you go.
Okay, yeah, I can't see you, Chris. I was just going to respond to Brandon's comment, in terms of hiring faculty of color. That is a huge issue. And as I was telling my fellow panelists and friends before we started, I'm on a search committee right now hiring 3 faculty, and that is at the front of our thinking, and not only, hiring, but how do you recruit? Where do you get that word out to get diverse applicants? But yeah, and we have had very tough conversations around the structural inequities in terms of just even mentoring doctoral students of color, and what happens with white doctoral students that doesn't happen with doctoral students of color. So it has been, here again, this has been part of my journey here, just even in 2021. But that is a critical piece of changing the institutions that, speaking of for Radford, we are very white, and our population is changing. We are, I think, now at least 40% students of color, and our faculty do not reflect that.
So do you have any plans on changing that?
Yes, I mean, just as I was saying, we are in this process right now of hiring, and we were very intentional about recruiting faculty of color. And so that, yes, that we are actively working to change that, at least in my area. And I know that I don't have a say in other departments, but I know that with colleagues in other departments, that is something that they are intentionally trying to address and actively working toward.
Sorry. No, I was gonna say, sorry I dropped out there. It's fitting that we would have to have this conference online to protect all of you, and then one of the black voices in the room drops out because of bad internet, right? But kind of sorry, everybody, that I dropped out. My name is Brandon Zellers. I'm a second-year graduate student here at App. I teach Appalachian music. I'm writing a thesis on the effects of mass consumption and on Appalachian music. I have a podcast network, the Drag Clamp at Square Dance, where me and some other graduate students talk about other Appalachian stuff. So that's kind of who I am, not just the guy who just kind of dropped out. That's kind of one thing that we've had discussions even prior to this panel at Appalachian State about sort of how we're going to kind of decenter whiteness at the center down here. And Julie kind of came with some action steps, but like Chris, you, for example, I heard you say you wanted to do a lot of talking. You know, I didn't really hear the action in what you were wanting to do. You know, yes.
Oh, just because you dropped out, Chris had started to address the question that you raised specifically, I think, about hiring. So let's let him talk through that, and then we'll open it back up.
With Appalachian Studies, there are very few professors here. So there are people who have tenure. But what I can do, and I have done for the college, as and this is getting into Berea is incredibly intentional about reaching out and actively recruiting, and both people of color and not just American too. Also of training our faculty and staff. So there's one program that began, and I'll give you this example, of where we were working with young men who we noticed were dropping out at a higher rate. So there was a really strong group with our African-American colleagues. We're able to put together a strong group. We were able to muster one for our Appalachian people, but for our Latino men, there was nobody. And so I was really the person who was behind the drive to change and include. Our college has recently had a real debate, what should count as diversity for a class. And I was thinking, or for your 10% of our student body at least, that should count as diversity, because I used to be Appalachian, African-American, and women. Well, what about these new Latino students? They're doing the work. They're taking those Latino studies classes. They are learning the core things. And my students, and students of all kinds in those classes, are learning those core things. So after 3 years of work, we finally got it changed to broaden it out. But that was through a lot of conversation and a lot of talking that we were able to bring about those changes. And we were able to hire people so that those changes are going on and are very actively being pursued, but they're done, again, through people coming together and talking in this version of it.
Right. No, and I agree with you, right? Action is sort of the second part of speech. You can't really have defined actions if you don't kind of talk about them first, right? But I just want to know, because one thing that I heard you also talk about is this idea of accountability, or this idea of, you know, forming these sort of student committees or these student faculty committees. Let me just ask, how many Black people teach at each of your centers? Because I know the answer for Julie, and I think it's one, and I think it's me.
I am a program of one. I have one adjunct and white.
Chris?
For me, there is myself, there's Silas House, who is a halftime person. We have been assigned people by the administration, is what I will say. We do not get a chance to hire. There is a regularly taught class that Bill Turner started that has always been taught by a faculty of color, and that's Blacks in Appalachia or Native Americans. Would I welcome more? Absolutely. Is there room within the Berea structure and the demands of African American studies, of Latino studies, of the different places, I have to work with people as they are too. So it's a matter of cultivation, and it's a matter of communication, but it's not a matter of me just stamping my foot and saying it has to happen, because that unfortunately doesn't work.
Well,
I mean,
I think that gets a little bit to this idea of like, I wanted to be clear in like positioning these three panelists in the intermediary spaces that they inhabit, that they and one of the questions that we haven't had a chance to talk about are like, what are the structures that create challenges around this work, and how are administrations above each of you working to overcome those challenges? I don't know if anybody wants to address that, because I do think it's important to like to hear these very real concerns and put them in a context to figure out how does this conversation turn to action. Does anybody want to talk about that question around like the challenges at your institutions and in this work? I mean, we've talked a little bit about hiring right now, right? That each of you have very small programs. Anything anybody wants to say around that?
Well, I'll mention a conversation that Brandon and I had last semester in terms of thinking like through a concrete action, and that would be to raise a lot of money, right? So money is one of the challenges, but to have an endowment in which we could fund a student of color for a full ride for 2 years of graduate school, so that they wouldn't have to pay a penny to come here. And it's, a way of working towards that goal of equity, and something that can happen. The challenge, of course, is finding someone to donate the money, of raising the money, of capacity to raise the money, those sorts of things. But I do think that that is a long-term goal of the centers, to do that work, and to make it a space that we have and can offer a student of color that. So that's just one thought about kind of challenges, but also, something we're working towards that's more concrete.
Could I come in this?
Yes. Hi, Wilburn.
Hi. I think one of the things that always troubled me is that at white institutions, the athletic department does an excellent job of recruiting coaches and Black players. So, what are they doing? And we had conversations with how, in fact, you can look at the championship going on now, and most of the white universities will have a team of 5 starting. And the coaches, finally have Black coaches. So, and they're the same place that we are as institutions. We go to the same games. So they're having the same, or I think the same type of challenges. But what it is about athletic programs that academic programs can't do. And maybe, as Julie said, maybe it's about money. I don't know, but I think it's more than just money. My roughly thinking about it is that they want to win. And so winning, what is winning in an academic science setting? It's about publications, it's about research grants. So it's different when you're trying to get to be the #1 team in the conference and to be the #1 academic institution. Those things don't come together. So I think we need to figure out how to have more conversations with athletic directors or our administration to say, what gives? Why is it we don't have the same priority as we give our athletic departments?
I think for anyone not speaking, if you can mute, I have the power to mute people, but it feels really rude for me to mute people. So if you'll stay muted while not speaking, I think we'll keep that echo from happening. Yeah, thoughts, responses to Wilburn's good point. And then I want to make sure we get to this earlier question from Betty.
Yeah, Wilburn, when you were speaking, I think that what you're pointing out is that historical, I mean, it reflects systemic racism and stereotyping. And as you said, rather rhetorically, you know, if it can work in athletics, why can't it work on the academic side of the house? I think about even at Radford right now, I mentioned Dr. Sharon Jones, my colleague, who has been leading these book groups on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And her husband is a basketball coach. And if you look at our basketball team, it is primarily African Americans. Our president of the university is African American. He's actually leaving. He's going to ODU this summer, but he's been here for, I think, 6 years. And as I said, the student body, the university has done a really good job of recruiting students of color. But the Brandon, to your point, the hiring of faculty has not, well, it's behind, woefully behind. So, yeah, I mean, I think, and in speaking, talking about just talking, you've got to raise these, you've got to bring them out into conversation, to point them out, so people have to confront them, because once they're spoken and they're out there, you can't hide. Well, I guess you could hide, but it makes it more difficult. And then hopefully with enough faculty push and student push, changes will occur. Structural changes will happen.
I see a note from Tom Hansel in the chat. Tom, do you mind speaking for yourself? If not, I can read for you.
Yeah, I have to learn how to unmute myself. Can you hear me all right?
You did it.
Okay. I was just pointing out, and actually Brandon pointed this out at first, that another challenge is credentialing. And I think if we are looking at Appalachian studies as a community-centered interdisciplinary field, we need to think about these hiring requirements. And so the question I posed, does community experience count less or more than a PhD to a hiring committee? Also to upper level administrators who may actually make the final decision. So I think those are, if we're talking about decentering whiteness and we're talking about kind of changing things up, I think this issue of credentialing needs to be on the table to be discussed.
And really, Tom, that's a great point. And it goes beyond even the institutions, right? If we look at SACS accreditation and what they count as, who's legitimate. In Virginia, it's the SHEV, State Council of Higher Education. So it goes even beyond the institutions.
Well, and it isn't accidental. These structures are in place to keep people in power who have had power. It's easy to feel like these are impossible structures to change. But I so appreciate, Chris, the way you talked about Berea at the beginning here, about the way that it's always evolving. And, Brandon, when you and I talked, was that this week, last week, whenever that was, one of the things that surprised me in that conversation, I'll just kind of explain to the other people in the conversation here. Brandon and I met this way last week or so, and there were real questions about what is the role of the institution, an institution like ASA. And I surprised myself, Brandon, with the way that I defended this organization, because I'm pretty cynical. And what I found after we hung up, and as I kept thinking, is that I do believe that cynicism leads to evolution, that we have to ask hard questions. We have to be uncomfortable. We have to be called out. But I believe that an organization especially one structured like ASA that is interdisciplinary, that does bring together scholars and activists. I have a lot of faith that this can be a place. And Julie, I think I won't get your words exactly right, but you talked about like turning it inside out or kind of blowing it up and really radically changing what Appalachian studies looks like and what the programs mean and what the field means. And so, I mean, that's why I'm in this role, is because I do believe in the power there. And I think Sandy Ballard's in this meeting, and she pointed this out to me years ago when I was feeling kind of like Brandon is right now. I was fed up and I was like, this is broken. And she was like, yeah, it's always been that way. And those tensions are productive. There have always been tensions in ASA. Sandy, I don't know if I'm getting your words right. Do you remember that conversation?
I do. We bring together artists as well as activists, as well as educators, as well as people who are who love living here and want it to be better. And it's when those kinds of people get together that you start to see new possibilities, I think. And that's one of the things about this organization that is pretty special. I mean, it's always been that way. When you get together at Highlander Center, it's people listening to each other and sitting in rocking chairs and talking and telling their stories. And when you listen to those stories and you hear, wow, I thought we had nothing in common until you said that. That's There aren't that many spaces in the world, that provide that kind of encouragement. And so I think we look for it where we can find it, and when we find it, we try to make it work better.
Yeah. Thanks, Sandy. There's a great question here in the chat. Unina, do you want to unmute and share your question?
Sure, happy to. Good morning. My name is Unina Barber Payne. I am an artist, a performance scholar and artist, and I work with Appalachian Memory Plays. And my question, I'm also a doctoral student, so kind of straddling that line between being an independent artist and also being in an institution right now at the University of Texas in the Department of Theater and Dance. And my question is with regards to historically Black colleges and universities and really historically Black institutions in Appalachia. I also work with the Christiansburg Institute in Southwest Virginia on the board there. So I'm just curious about really if in this conversation regarding decentering whiteness, where are there any plans or any thoughts, or maybe you all could speak to intentions to build allyships and partnerships with HBCUs, and not just on the collegiate level, but of course there are many historically Black institutions in Appalachia at large. And if maybe you could speak to future plans or things that have happened in the past. I know that I've been in this space long enough to know that the Christiansburg Institute has been one that's been like here in ASA and kind of represented from a distance, or I think like I remember going into sessions and hearing about the work, but I wonder if on the ground, especially as each of you all hold positions in institutions, if you could talk about what that looks like on an administrative level.
I'll start briefly and then I'll pass it off to the others. That's exactly my goal for this next year. I think that we have historically, my perception right now is that someone used this language of like, we open the door, and when people don't rush in, we think, well, they must not be interested. And I think that passive approach to partnerships in the community, it isn't serving anyone. And so my primary goal in terms of putting, as Brandon's calling us to do, putting words into actions, my primary goal is to try to build these partnerships with community organizations. And I appreciate you pointing out the HBCUs. I actually hadn't thought about that. I had been thinking more about community organizations, but really actively thinking about how can we find reciprocal relationships that will be mutually beneficial. I'll pass it to those of you working in institutions.
I'm thinking about ASA as a whole, and having been president and run two of the conferences, I've been involved in it. One of the things that ASA has always wrestled with is trying to keep the prices low and also invite people in. I was talking with one of my colleagues in the mid-90s, trying to get teachers to come from Cincinnati. Very difficult. So even though we are a more open organization to diverse positionality, it is more and more, it is difficult to help community members and to get them the money and to empower and to also say, yes, we value you. So there are many steps we have to think about in doing that. I think that there has been enough experience and other members who have thought about these things to come together, and Meredith to be of service and helping to think about some serious ways to be able to make those bridges too.
We are basically at time. I'll just open it up if Julie or Teresa want to jump in there. Oh, okay, and Rachel Turman, who is speaking on behalf of the steering committee, points out that the Diversity and Inclusion Committee has been talking about these relationships with HBCUs. That's great, Rachel.
Can I say something super quick about what Chris just said? I was able to use faculty development money. I just did a grant to do some faculty development money to at our institution at Ferrum to get 3 community members from the Gainsborough area and Roanoke to come several years ago to ASA to a session. It was an awesome session. We had very low turnout, you know how we split ourselves up so much. And that was a little disappointing, but it did start some stuff. So I think we can leverage already their pots of money creatively to make sure that we get people that we know need to be at the table. And that work is still ongoing. We're still working with that community group, and we always will be. So there are ways.
Thank you for that. I want to point out that Betty put her email address there. She was talking about something at the Smithsonian that I think is important and would be a good opportunity for people doing this work. So grab her email address if you'd like to. Thank you all for being here. Thank you especially to Chris, Julie, Teresa. Thank you to Brandon for your good questions and for the other good questions that we had in this panel. This is just a beginning, and I really look forward to continuing this conversation for years, for the duration of ASA, for the duration of Appalachian Studies programs. I think these need to be central questions. So thanks so much for being here, y'all.
And thank you, Meredith, for pulling us together.
Yes, thank you, Meredith.
Thank you.
Bye.